I turned 65, I thought I had life figured out. My wife had passed away 5 years earlier. My 2 children were grown and busy with their own families, and I had just finished my last day at the factory. 40 years of hard work behind me, a small pension, and a quiet house ahead. I imagined my retirement as peaceful, maybe a little lonely, but calm. I would wake up without an alarm clock, drink coffee on the porch, watch the sunrise, and maybe tinker with old radios like I used to when I was young. But the first month felt like standing in an empty room after the music stops. The silence was heavy. No one needed me. No schedules, no coworkers, no responsibilities. Just me and the ticking of a clock that seemed louder every day. I tried to keep busy, fixed the leaky faucet, cleaned the garage, even joined the local seniors walking club. But the conversations were shallow, and everyone seemed to already have their little circles of friends. I smiled, nodded, and went home alone again. One evening, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. I wondered if this was it, the rest of my life. Just a quiet fade into the background, waiting for phone calls that rarely came. Then something strange happened. A moving truck stopped across the street in front of the old Carson house. It had been empty for years. Out came a man, tall, gray-haired, wearing a long brown coat that looked a size too big. He moved slowly but deliberately, carrying boxes one by one as if each had a story. For reasons I couldn't explain, I kept watching. There was something about him, maybe the way he looked around the neighborhood, almost cautious, like he was trying to remember a place from long ago. The next morning, I saw him again. He was sitting on his porch with a cup of tea, staring at the horizon just as I often did. Our eyes met for a moment. He nodded politely. I nodded back. 2 old men, both starting over, though neither of us knew it yet. That night, as I sat in my living room, I found myself thinking about him. Who was this stranger who'd moved in so quietly? Why did he look familiar? I didn't realize it then, but meeting that man would change the course of my retirement and my understanding of life itself. The next few days followed a strange rhythm. Every morning, I'd glance out my window and see the man across the street, always up early, always calm. Sometimes he swept the porch, other times he just sat there with a notebook, writing something with slow, careful strokes. I didn't want to seem nosy, but curiosity tugged at me like a loose thread. One morning, I decided to wave. Simple as that. I raised my hand across the street. He looked up, smiled faintly, and waved back. It wasn't much, but it broke the ice. Later that afternoon, I noticed him struggling with a heavy box near his truck. Instinct took over. I crossed the street and said, "Need a hand?" He looked at me for a second before answering. His voice was quiet, a little rough, as if he hadn't spoken much lately. "Appreciate it," he said. "It's heavier than it looks." We carried the box inside together. His house smelled faintly of old books and cedar. The walls were lined with framed photographs, landscapes, faces, even what looked like military pictures. One caught my eye, a young man in uniform standing beside an airplane. "That you?" I asked, nodding toward the photo. He hesitated, then smiled slightly. "Once upon a time." We ended up talking for nearly an hour. His name was Henry Lawson. He'd been a pilot, Air Force, retired years ago. Lost his wife a long time back, no kids. He'd moved here to find some peace, as he put it. I knew that feeling all too well. From that day on, our lives began to intertwine. We started meeting for coffee in the mornings, sometimes on his porch, sometimes on mine. We didn't talk about anything deep at first, just the weather, the news, the price of gas. But beneath the small talk, I felt something familiar. The quiet ache of 2 men trying to find meaning after everyone else had moved on. One afternoon he asked, "You ever think about how we spend our last years?" I chuckled. "Every day." He nodded thoughtfully. "Most people see retirement as the end. I think it's just another mission. Only this time, we decide what it means." There was something about the way he said it. Steady, deliberate. That stuck with me. I didn't know yet that Henry wasn't just talking about himself. He was laying the foundation for something far greater. something that would test both of us in ways I couldn't imagine. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't dread waking up the next morning. I wanted to see what would happen next. A week after our dinner, Harold showed up at my door holding an envelope. He looked serious, almost hesitant. "Can I come in?" he asked. I nodded, sensing that something had shifted. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place we'd shared coffee so many times. He slid the envelope toward me. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "You've been wasting away here, Jim. You've got good hands, sharp instincts. You should be doing something again." I frowned. "Doing something? Harold, I'm retired. I'm supposed to be resting, remember?" He smiled faintly. "Resting is fine, but you and I both know that men like us don't rest well. We need purpose." I hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a small stack of papers, property listings, financial statements, and a handwritten note that simply read, "Partnership? What's this?" I asked, confused. "I've been saving for years," Harold said, "but not for travel or luxury. I want to restore that old train depot by the river, turn it into a community center, a place for veterans, retirees, anyone who needs something to hold on to." I laughed softly. "You're serious?" He nodded. "Dead serious. I can fund the repairs, but I can't do it alone. I need someone who knows people, who understands this town." It was the strangest thing anyone had ever asked me. I'd spent my whole life working by routine, saving for quiet days like these. Yet suddenly, the thought of doing something meaningful stirred something in me. I hadn't felt in years hope. "I don't know," I said. "It sounds big." "It is," he replied. "But that's why it matters." For the rest of the evening, we went over the details. Harold knew every figure, every cost, every permit needed. I didn't understand how one man could be so prepared. "You've been planning this for a while, haven't you?" I asked. "Since before I moved here," he said, looking down. "I didn't come to this town by accident, Jim." Something in his tone made me pause. But before I could ask, he changed the subject, told a joke, poured another cup of tea, and the moment passed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The papers lay on my desk, and I found myself reading the note again. Partnership? The next morning, I walked to Harold's house. He was already on his porch, waiting, as if he knew I'd come. I handed him the envelope and said, "If we're doing this, we do it together." He smiled for the first time in days. "Together," he said. I didn't know it yet, but that decision would unravel the mystery of who Harold really was, and why he'd chosen me. A week later, while sorting through her mail, Margaret found an envelope with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, yet she couldn't place it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed slightly, as if it had been written some time ago. The note began simply, "Dear Margaret," if you're reading this, I suppose I've already failed to say these words in person, but I wanted to thank you, not for the money or the help, but for treating me like a person again. Her breath caught. The signature at the bottom, Edward, sent her heart racing. It was from him. She hadn't realized how much she had been waiting to hear from him until that moment. The letter went on to reveal Edward's side of the story, his wife's long illness, the guilt that consumed him after her death, and how his retreat from the world wasn't loneliness by choice, but punishment he thought he deserved. He described how Margaret's warmth, her laughter, and even her gentle scolding about his diet had made him feel human again. You reminded me that even in the twilight of life, it's not too late to start over, he wrote. Tears blurred the ink. Margaret folded the letter carefully, as if afraid to hurt the paper. That evening she sat on her porch with the sunset stretching across the horizon. The light made everything golden. The garden, the fence, the empty chair beside her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. Edward might have disappeared, but his words had anchored her in something larger than loss, a quiet, unexpected gratitude. That night, she placed the letter inside a small box with her most treasured keepsakes, an old photo of her late husband, a postcard from her son, and now Edward's letter, 3 reminders that even when people leave, their presence lingers in the moments they've touched. Margaret whispered into the darkness, Thank you, Edward. The wind outside stirred gently, rustling the trees almost as if the world had heard her and answered back. 3 months passed. The leaves had turned gold and red, falling softly onto Margaret's porch steps. Life had returned to its gentle rhythm, morning tea, a stroll through the garden, and her weekly volunteer shifts at the local library. Still, every time she walked by the park bench where she and Edward had shared stories, she felt a pang of longing. One crisp autumn morning, while she was shelving books, a familiar voice broke her routine. Do you still hide the good novels on the top shelf so no one else can find them? Margaret froze. She turned slowly, and there he was, Edward. His hair was thinner, his frame a little frailer, but the same soft humor danced in his eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she laughed, and tears filled her eyes. I thought you'd gone for good, she said, her voice trembling. I almost did, he admitted, but then I realized maybe I wasn't finished living yet. They sat down together in the quiet reading corner. He told her about how he had left to visit his daughter, how they'd started mending their strained relationship. He'd found a small apartment near the sea, started painting again, and even joined a group of retired sailors who met every Thursday to tell stories and complain about the weather. Margaret listened, smiling through her tears. There was something beautiful about his presence. No grand gestures, no promises, just quiet sincerity. When Edward took her hand, it was steady, warm, and certain. I don't want to disappear again, he said, if you'll still have a grumpy old fool like me around. She chuckled softly. I waited 3 months, Edward. You owe me a lot of tea and a walk or two in the park. The library clock chimed noon. Outside, sunlight filtered through the window, catching the dust in golden streaks. It felt like time itself had paused just to let two souls, weathered by loss and years, rediscover the gentle rhythm of companionship. Margaret didn't know what the future held, but at that moment, sitting beside Edward as he smiled that crooked smile of his, she realized something profound. Sometimes life gives you a second chance, quietly, without warning, disguised as an ordinary day in autumn. After Edward's return, Margaret's days began to shift subtly. The quiet solitude she had cherished for years now shared space with laughter, conversation, and occasional disagreements over trivial matters, like whose turn it was to make tea, or whether the roses in the garden needed more water. Life was no longer just a sequence of predictable tasks. It was peppered with small surprises and unexpected joy. They started taking morning walks together, exploring streets Margaret hadn't noticed in decades. Edward pointed out architectural details she'd overlooked, while she introduced him to her favorite hidden cafes, where the baristas greeted them warmly, as if expecting their laughter to fill the room. Evenings became moments of reflection. They shared memories, some funny, some bittersweet. Edward would recount tales of his youth at sea, tales filled with storms in distant lands. Margaret shared stories of her travels, of books she'd read that shaped her perspective, of quiet heartbreaks that no one had noticed. One chilly evening, as the wind rustled golden leaves outside, Edward hesitated before speaking. I never thought I'd find someone willing to walk through life with an old man like me. Margaret smiled, resting her hand on his. You're not just any old man, Edward. You've got stories, warmth, and a stubbornness that matches mine perfectly. They laughed, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly seen. The past, for all its disappointments and losses, seemed less like a burden and more like a prelude to this unexpected chapter. In the quiet corners of her home, they built routines that were simple but meaningful, shared breakfasts, late-night conversations, gardening together, and slowly learning each other's quirks. Margaret realized that rebuilding life wasn't about erasing the past. It was about weaving new threads into the tapestry, threads that glimmered with companionship, trust, and hope. Even on days when the world outside seemed gray and uncertain, within the walls of their shared moments, life felt richer, fuller, and unexpectedly bright. Just as Margaret began to feel comfortable in this new rhythm of life, echoes of the past crept back. Old fears, regrets, and insecurities, the kind that had kept her cautious for so long, began to surface. Sometimes, in quiet moments, she would recall the harsh words from her divorce, the loneliness of years spent alone, and wonder if she deserved this happiness. Edward noticed her moments of hesitation. One afternoon, while they sat on the porch sipping tea, he gently asked, "Are you thinking about the old days?" Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And I guess I'm just scared. Scared that all this could vanish, that I'll lose it as I've lost so much before." Edward reached over, holding her hand firmly. "We can't undo the past, Margaret. But we can decide how much space it occupies in our present. What matters is what we're building now, not what once broke us." This conversation became a turning point. Margaret began to confront her past, not with shame or fear, but with reflection. She wrote letters she never intended to send, speaking to those who had hurt her and to herself, acknowledging the pain and the lessons it brought. Together, she and Edward took a symbolic journey, revisiting places that held memories of loss, the old park where she had wept, the cafe where she had celebrated brief victories alone. Each visit, they infused the space with laughter, small acts of joy, and a sense of reclaiming what had once been tainted by sorrow. Margaret realized that shadows could coexist with light. The past, with all its weight, could serve as a guide rather than a chain. And with Edward by her side, each memory became part of a larger narrative, one of resilience, forgiveness, and the courage to embrace life fully, even in its unpredictability. By the time autumn leaves began to fall, Margaret felt an inner peace she hadn't known in decades. She understood that facing the past didn't diminish the present. Instead, it strengthened it, making her new life with Edward richer, deeper, and more meaningful than she had ever imagined. The winter sun cast a gentle glow over Margaret's garden, where she and Edward often spent their mornings. It had been months since they first met, and in that time, her life had transformed in ways she never imagined possible. The stranger who had walked into her quiet retirement years had brought more than companionship. He had brought hope, laughter, and a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret stood by the window, looking at the frost-kissed flowers, and reflected on her journey. She remembered the fear she once felt after her divorce, the loneliness that had seemed endless, and the cautious heart that had kept her from trusting anyone again. Yet, here she was, smiling, planning small adventures, and embracing each day with gratitude. Edward entered with 2 mugs of steaming tea and a mischievous grin. "Thinking too much again?" he teased. Margaret laughed softly, shaking her head. "Just thinking how lucky I am. How a chance meeting changed everything." They spent the afternoon together, recounting their favorite moments, the long walks through the park, the quiet dinners, the laughter-filled evenings. Each story was a reminder of how life, even in its later chapters, could surprise you with joy and connection. Margaret realized that happiness was not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It was about small moments, shared understanding, and the courage to open her heart again. She had learned that life could be rewritten at any age, and that every ending carried the seed of a new beginning. As the sun set, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, Margaret and Edward sat hand in hand, feeling the warmth of love and companionship. The stranger who had once appeared as a fleeting presence in her life had become her anchor, her partner, and her inspiration. In that serene moment, Margaret understood the profound truth. Life never truly ends, it evolves. And with every ending, there is the promise of a new beginning, waiting to be embraced with courage, hope, and an open heart.